Novel The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, Chapter number 14, June 2001. I lowered the phone into the cradle and stared at it for a long time. It was not until Aflatun startled me with a bark that I realized how quiet the room had become. Suraya had muted the television. You look pale, Amir, she said from the couch, the same one her parents had given us as a housewarming gift for our first apartment. He had been lying on it with Aflatun's head nestled on her chest, her legs buried under the worn pillows. She was half watching a PBS special on the plight of wolves in Minnesota, half correcting essays from her summer school class. She had been teaching at the same school now for 6 years. She sat up and Aflatun leapt down from the couch. It was the journal who had given our cocker spaniel his name, Farsi for Plato, because he said if you looked hard enough and long enough into the dog's filmy black eyes, you would swear he was thinking wise thoughts. There was a silver of fat, just a hint of it beneath Suraya's chin now. The past 10 years had padded the curves of her hips some and combed into her coal black hair a few streaks of cinder grey, but she still had the face of grand bald princess with her bird in flight eyebrows and nose elegantly carved like a letter from ancient Arabic writings. Look pale, Suraya repeated, placing the stack of papers on the table. I have to go to Pakistan. She stood up now. Pakistan, Rahim Khan is very sick. A fist clenched inside me with those words. Kaka's old business partner. She had never met Rahim Khan, but I had told her about him. I nodded. Oh, she said, I am so sorry, Amir. We used to be close, I said. When I was kid, he was the first grown-up I ever thought of as a friend. I pictured him and Baba drinking tea in Baba's study, then smoking near the window, a sweet briar-scented breeze blowing from the garden and bending the twin columns of smoke. I remember you telling me, Dad, Surya said. She paused. How long will you be gone? I don't know. He wants to see me. Is it? Yes, it's safe. I will be alright, Surya. It was the question she had wanted to ask all along. 15 years of marriage had turned us into mind readers. I am going to go for a walk. Should I go with you? Nah, I would rather be alone. I drove to the Golden Gate Park and walked along Sprinkles Lake on the northern edge of the park. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon. The sun sparkled on the water where dozens of miniature boats sailed, propelled by a crisp San Francisco breeze. I sat on a park bench, watched a man toss a football to his son, telling him to not sidearm the ball to throw over the shoulder. I glanced up and saw a pair of kites, red with long blue tails. They floated high above the trees on the west end of the park over the windmills. I thought about to comment Rahim Khan had made just before we hung up, made it in passing almost as an afterthought. I closed my eyes and saw him at the other end of the scratchy long distant line, saw him with his lips slightly parted, headed to one side, and again something in his bottomless black eyes hinted at an unspoken secret between us, except now I knew he knew. My suspicions had been right all those years. He knew about Asif, the kite, the money, the watch with the lightning bolt hands. He had always known. Come, there is a way to be good again, Rahim Khan had said on the phone just before hanging up, said it in passing almost as an afterthought. A way to be good again? When I came home, Suraya was on the phone with her mother. Won't be long, Mother Jan. A week, maybe two. Yes, you and Padar can stay with me. 2 years earlier, the general had broken his right hip. He could had one of his migraines again, and emerging from his room, bleary-eyed and dazed, he had tripped in on a loose carpet edge. His scream had brought Khala Jamila running from the kitchen. It sounded like a jaru, a broomstick snapping in half. She was always fond of saying, though the doctor had said it was unlikely she had heard anything of the sort. The general's shattered hip and all of the ensuing complications, the pneumonia, blood poisoning, the protracted stay at the nursing home, ended Khala Jamila's long-running soliloquies about her own health and started new ones about the journals. She could tell anyone who would listen that the doctors had told them his kidneys were failing, but then they had never seen Afghan kidneys, had they? She could say proudly. What I remember most about the general's hospital stay is how Khala Jamila would wait until he fell asleep and then sing to him songs. I remembered from the Kabul playing on the Baba's scratchy old transistor radio. The general's Formality and the time had softened things between him and Suraya too. They took a walk together, went to lunch on Saturdays, and sometimes the general sat in some of her classes. He could sit in the back of the room dressed in his shiny old grey suit, wooden cane across his lap, smiling. Sometimes he even looked notes. That night Suraya and I lay in bed, her back pressed to my chest, my face buried in her hairs. I remember when we used to lay forehead to forehead, sharing after glow kisses and whispering until our eyes drifted close, whispering about tiny curled toes, first smiles, first words, first steps. We still did sometimes, but the whispers were about school, my new book, a giggle over someone's ridiculous dress at a party. Our love making was still good. At times better than good, but some nights all I could feel was a relief to be done with it. To be free to drift away and forget, at least for a while, about the futility of what we had just done. She never said so, what I knew sometimes Suraya felt it too. On those nights, we could each roll to our side of the bed and let our own Savior take us away. Suraya's was sleep, mine was a book. I lay in the dark the night Rahim Khan called and traced with my eyes the parallel silver lines on the wall made by moonlight pouring through the blinds. At some point, maybe just before dawn, I drifted to sleep and dreamed of Hassan running in the snow, the hemp of his green chapan dragging behind him, snow crunching under his black rubber boots. He was yelling over his shoulder for you 1,000 times over. A week later, I sat on a window seat aboard a Pakistani International Airlines flight, watching a pair of uniformed airline workers remove the wheel chokes. The plane taxied out of the terminal, and soon we were airborne. Cutting through the clouds, I rested my head against the window, waited in vain for sleep. Chapter number 15. 3 hours later, my flight landed in Peshawar. I was sitting on shredded upholstery in the back seat of a smoke-filled taxi cab. My driver, a chain-smoking, sweety little man who introduced himself as Ghulam, drove nonchalantly and recklessly, avoiding collisions by the thinnest of margins, all without so much as a pause in the incessant stream of words spewing from his mouth. Terrible what is happening in your country, yaar. Afghani people and Pakistani people, they are like brothers. I tell you, Muslims have to help Muslims so. I tuned him out, switched to a polite nodding mood. I remembered Peshawar pretty well from a few months Baba and I had spent there in 1981. We were heading west now on Jamrood Road, past the cantonment and its lavish high-walled homes. The bustle of the city blurring past me reminded me of a busier, more crowded version of the Kabul. I knew particularly of the Kochek Morga or a chicken bazaar where Hassan and I used to buy chutney dipped potatoes and cherry water. The streets were clogged with bicycle riders, smiling pedestrians and rickshaws, popping blue smoke, all waving through a maze of narrow lanes and alleys. Bearded vendors draped into the blankets sold animal skin, lampshades, carpets, embroidered shawls, and copper goods from row of small, tightly jammed stalls. The city was bursting with sounds. The shouts of our vendors rang in my ears, mingled with the blare of Hindi music. The sputtering of rickshaws and the jingling bells of the horse-drawn cars, rich scents both pleasant and not so pleasant, drifted to me through the passenger window. The spicy aroma of pakoda and the nehari Baba had loved so much blended with the sting of diesel fumes, the stench of a road garbage and feces. A little past the red brick buildings of Peshawar University was entered an area my garrulous driver referred to as Afghan town. I saw sweet shops and carpet vendors, kebab stalls, kids with dirt-caked hands selling cigarettes, tiny restaurant, maps of Afghanistan painted on their windows, all interlaced with the backstreet aid agencies. Many of your brothers in the area, yaar, they are opening businesses, but most of them are very poor. He touched his tongue and sighed. Anyway, we are getting close now. I thought about the last time I had seen Rahim Khan in 1981. He had come to say goodbye the night Baba and I had fled Kabul. I remember Baba and his embracing in the foyer, crying softly. When Baba and I arrived in the US, he and Rahim Khan kept in touch. They would speak 4 or 5 times a year, and sometimes Baba would pass me the receiver. The last time I had spoken to Rahim Khan had been shortly after Baba's death. The news had reached Kabul and he had called. We had only spoken for a few minutes and lost the connection. The driver pulled up to the narrow building at a busy corner where two winding streets intersected. I paid the driver, took my lone suitcase, and walked up to the intricately carved door. The building had wooden balconies with open shutters. From the many of them, laundry was hanging to dry in the sun. I walked up the creaky stairs to the second floor, down a dim hallway to the last door on the right. Checked the address on the piece of stationery paper in my palm. Knocked. Then a thing made of skin and bones, pretending to be Rahim Khan, opened the door. A creative writing teacher at San Jose State used to say about cliches, avoid them like a plague. Then he would laugh at his own joke. The class laughed along with him, but I always thought cliches got a bum rap because often they are dead on, but the aptness of the cliched saying is overshadowed by the nature of saying as a cliche. For example, the elephant in the room saying nothing could more correctly describe the initial moment of my reunion with Rahim Khan. We sat on a wispy mattress set along the wall across the window, overlooking to the noisy street below. Sunlight slanted in and cast a triangular wedge of a light onto the one rug on the floor. Two folding chairs rested against one wall, and a small copper samovar sat in the opposite corner. I poured a tea from it. How did you find me? I asked. It's not difficult to find people in America. I bought a map of the US and the called up information for cities in Northern California, he said. It's wonderfully strange to see you as grown man. I smiled and dropped 3 sugar cubes in my tea. He liked his black and bitter. I remembered Baba didn't get the chance to tell you, but I got married 15 years ago. The truth was, by then the cancer in Baba's brain had made him forgetful, negligent. You are married to Wom. Her name is Suraya Tahiri. I thought of her back home worrying about me. I was glad she was not alone. Tahiri, whose daughter is she? I told him. His eyes brightened. Oh yes, I remember now. Isn't General Tahiri married to Sharif Jan's sister? What was her name? Jamila Jan. Bale, he said, smiling. I knew Sharif Jan in Kabul long time ago before he moved to America. He's been working for the INS for years, handles a lot of Afghan cases. Hi, he said. Do you and Saraya Jan have children? Nah. Oh, he slurped his tea and didn't ask more. Rahim Khan had always been one of the most instinctive people I had ever met. I told him a lot about Baba, his job, the flea market, and how at the end he had died happy. I told him about my schooling, my books, 4 published novel to my credit now. He smiled at this, said he had never had any doubt. I told him I had written short stories in the leather-bound notebook he had given me, but he didn't remember the notebook. The conversation inevitably turned to the Taliban. Is it as bad as I hear? I said, nah. It's worse, much worse, he said. Then he said, they don't let you be human. He pointed to a scar above his right eye, cutting a crooked path through his bushy eyebrow. I was at a soccer game in Ghazi Stadium in 1998, Kabul against Mazar-e-Sharif, I think. And by the way, the players were not allowed to wear shorts. Indecent exposure, I guess. He gave a tired laugh. Anyway, Kabul scored a goal and the man next to me cheered loudly. Suddenly, this young bearded fellow who was patrolling the aisles, 18 years old at most by the look of him, he walked up to me and struck me on the forehead with the butt of his Kalashnikov. Do that again and I will cut out your tongue. And you old donkey, he said. Rahim Khan rubbed the scar with a gnarled finger. I was old enough to be his grandfather, and I was sitting there, blood gushing down my face, apologizing to that son of a dog. I poured him more tea. Rahim talked some more. Much of it I knew already, some not. He told me that, as arranged between Baba and him, he had lived in Baba's house since 1981. This I knew about. Baba had sold the house to Rahim Khan shortly before he and I fled Kabul. The way Baba had seen it those days, Afghanistan's trouble were only a temporary interruption of our way of life. The days of parties at the Wazir Ali Akbar Khan house and picnics in Pagman would surely return. So he had given the house to Rahim Khan to keep watch over until that day. Rahim Khan told me how when the Northern Alliances took over Kabul between 1992 and 1996, different factions claimed different parts of Kabul. If you went from the Share Now section to Karte Parwan to buy a carpet, you risked getting shot by a sniper or getting blown up by a rocket. If you got past all the checkpoints, that was you practically needed a visa to go from one neighborhood to the other. So people just stayed put, prayed to the next rocket would not hit their home. He told me how people knocked holes in the walls of their homes so they could bypass the dangerous streets and would move down the block from the hole to hole. In other parts, people moved about in underground tunnels. Why didn't you leave? I said. Kabul was my home. It still is. He snickered. Remember the street that went from your house to the Kishla, the military barracks next to Istiklal School? Yes, it was the shortcut to the school. I remembered that day Hassan and I crossed it and the soldiers had teased Hassan about his mother. Hassan had cried in the cinema later and I had put arm around him. When the Taliban rolled in and kicked all the alliances out of the Kabul, I actually danced on the streets, Rahim Khan said. And believe me, I was not alone. People were celebrating at Chaman, at Deh Mazang, greeting the Taliban in the streets, climbing their tanks and posing for pictures with them. People were so tired of the constant fighting, tired of the rockets, the gunfire, the explosions, tired of watching Gulbuddin and his cohort firing on anything that moved. The alliance did more damage to Kabul than the Shoravi. They destroyed your father's orphanage. Did you know that? Why? I said. Why would they destroy an orphanage? I remember sitting behind Baba the day they opened the orphanage. The wind had knocked off his hat and everyone had laughed, then stood and clapped when he had delivered his speech. And now it was just another pile of rubble. All the money Baba had spent, all those nights he had sweated over the blueprints, all the visits to the construction site to make sure every brick, every beam and every block was laid just right. Collateral damage, Rahim Khan said. You don't want to know, Amir Jan, what it was like sifting through the rubble of that orphanage. There were body parts of children. So when the Taliban came, they were heroes. Rahim Khan said, peace at last. Yes, hope is a strange thing, peace at last, but at what price? A violent coughing fit gripped Rahim Khan and rocked his gaunt body back and forth. When he spat into his handkerchief, it immediately stained red. I thought that was as good a time as any to address the elephants waiting with us in the tiny room. How are you? I asked. I mean, really, how are you? Dying actually, he said in a gurgling voice. Another round of a coughing, more blood on the handkerchief. He wiped his mouth, blotted his sweaty brow from one wasted temple to the other with his sleeve, and gave me a quick glance. When he nodded, I knew he had read the next question on my face. Not long, he breath. How long? He shrugged, coughed again. I don't think I will see the end of this summer, he said. Let me take you home with me. I can find you a good doctor. They are coming up with a new treatments all the time. There are new drugs and experimental treatment. We could enroll you in one. I was rambling and I knew it, but it was better than crying, which I was probably going to do anyway. He let out a chuff of a laughter, revealed missing lower incisor. It was the most tired laughter I had ever heard. I see America has infused you with the optimism that has made her so great. That's very good. We are a melancholic people. We Afghans are not. We wallow too much in ghamkhori and self-pity. We give in to lose to suffering, accept it as fact of life, even see it as necessary. Zindagi mikzara, we say life goes on, but I am not surrendering to fate here. I am being pragmatic. I have seen several good doctors here and they have given the same answer. I trust them and believe them. There is such a thing as God's will. There is only what you do and what you don't do, I said. Rahim Khan laughed. You sounded like your father just now. I miss him so much, but it is God's will, Amir Jan. It really is. He paused. Besides, there another reason I asked you to come here. I wanted to see you before I go. Yes, but something else to anything. You know all those years I lived in your father's house after you left? Yes. I was not alone for all of them. Hassan lived there with me. Hassan, I said. When was the last time I had spoken his name? Those thorny old barbs of guilt poured into me once more, as if speaking his name had broken a spell, set them free to torment me anew. Suddenly, the air in Rahim Khan's little flat was too thick, too hot, too rich with the smell of the street. I thought about writing you and telling you before, but I was not sure you wanted to know. Was I wrong? The truth was no, the lie was yes. I settled for something in between, I don't know. He coughed another patch of blood into the handkerchief. When he bent his head to spit, I saw honey-crusted sores on his scalp. I brought you here because I am going to ask something of you. I am going to ask you to do something for me. But before I do, I want to tell you about Hassan. Do you understand? Yes, I murmured. I want to tell you about him. I want to tell you everything. You will listen. I nodded. Then Rahim Khan sipped some more tea, rested his head against the wall, and spoke. Chapter number 16. There were a lot of reasons why I went to Hazarajat to find Hassan in 1986. The biggest one, Allah's forgive me, was that I was lonely. By then, most of my friends and relatives had either been killed or had escaped the country to Pakistan or Iran. I barely knew anyone in Kabul anymore, the city where I had lived my entire life. Everybody had fled. I would take a walk in the Karte Parwan section where the melon vendors used to hang out in the old days. You remember that spot? And I would not recognize anyone there. No one to greet, no one to sit down with me for chai, no one to share stories with, just greasy soldiers patrolling the streets. So eventually I stopped going out to the city. I would spend my days in your father's house, up in the study, reading your mother's old books, listening to the news, watching the communist propaganda on television. Then I would pray namaz, cook something eat, read some more, pray again, and go to bed. I would rise in the morning, pray, do it all over again. And with my arthritis, it was getting harder for me to maintain the house. My knee and the back were always aching. I would get up in the morning and it would take me at least 1 hour to shake the stiffness from my joints, especially in the winter time. I didn't want to let your father's house go to rot. We had all had many good times in the house, so many memories, Amir Jan. It was not right your father had designed that house himself. It had meant to so much to him, and besides, I had promised him I would care for it when he and you left for Pakistan. Now it was just me and the house, and I did my best. I tried to water the trees every few days, cut the lawn, tend to the flower, fix things that needed fixing, but even then I was not a young man anymore. But even so, I might have been able to manage at least for the while longer. But when news of your father's death reached me for the first time, I felt a terrible loneliness in the house, an unbearable emptiness. So one day I fueled up Buick and drove up to the Hazarajat. I remember that after Ali dismissed himself from the house, your father told me he and Hassan had moved to a small village just outside the Bamiyan. Ali had a cousin there, and as I recalled, I had no idea if Hassan would still be there, if anyone would even know of him or his whereabouts. After all, it had been 10 years since Ali and Hassan had left your father's house. Hassan would have been a grown man in 1986, 22, 23 years old. If he was even alive, that is the Shoravi. May they rot in hell for what they did to our Watan, killed so many of our young men. I don't have to tell you that, but with the grace of God, I found him there. It took very little searching. All I had to do was ask a few questions in Bamiyan, and people pointed me to his village. I do not even recall its name or whether it even had one, but I remember it was a scorching summer day and I was driving up a rutted dirt road, nothing on either side but sun-baked bushes, gnarled, spiny tree trunks and the dried grass like a pale straw. I passed a dead donkey rotting on the side of the road, and I turned a corner right in the middle of that barren land. I saw a cluster of mud houses beyond them, nothing but broad sky and mountains like their teeth. The people in Bamiyan had told me I would find him easily. He lived in the only house in the village that had a walled garden. The mud was short and poked with holes and closed the tiny house, which was really not much more than a glorified hut. Barefoot children were playing on the street, kicking a ragged tennis ball with a stick, and they stared when I pulled up and killed the engine. I knocked on the wooden door and stepped through into a yard that had very little in it save for a parched strawberry patch and a bare lemon tree. There was a tandoor in the corner in the shadow of an acacia tree, and I saw a man squatting beside it. He was placing dough on a large wooden spatula and slapping it against the walls of the tandoor. He dropped the dough when he saw me. I had to make him stop kissing my hands. Let me look at you, I said. He stepped away. He was so tall now. I stood on my toes and still just came up to his chin. The Bamiyan sun had toughened his skin and turned it several shades darker than I remembered, and he had lost a few of his front teeth. There were sparse strands of hair on his chin. Other than that, he had those same narrow green eyes, that scar on his upper lip, that round face, that affable smile. You would have recognized him, Amirjan, I'm sure of it. We went inside. There was a young, light-skinned Hazara woman swinging a shawl in a corner of the room. She was visibly expecting. This is my wife, Rahim Khan, Hassan said proudly. Her name is Farzana Jan. She was a shy woman, so courteous. She spoke in a voice barely higher than a whisper, and she would not raise her pretty hazel eyes to meet my gaze. But the way she was looking at Hassan, he might as well have been sitting on the throne at the ark. When is the baby coming? I said, after we all settled around the adobe room. There was nothing in the room, just a rug, a few dishes, a pair of mattresses, and a lantern. Inshallah, this winter, Hassan said. I am praying for a boy to carry on my father's name. Speaking of Ali, where is he? Hassan dropped his gaze. He told me that Ali and his cousin who had owned the house had been killed by a landmine 2 years before, just outside of Bamiyan. A landmine. Is there a more one way of dying, Amirjan? And for some crazy reasons, I became absolutely certain that it had been Ali's right leg, his twisted polio leg, that had finally betrayed him and stepped on that land mine. I was deeply saddened to hear Ali had died. Your father and I grew up together, as you know, and Ali had been with him as long as I could remember. I remember when we were all little, the year Ali got polio and almost died, your father would walk around the house all day crying. Farzana made us shorba with beans, turnip, and potatoes. We washed our hands and dipped fresh naan from the tandoor into the shorba. It was the best meal I had in months. It was then that I asked Hassan to move up to Kabul with me. I told him about the house, how I could not care for it by myself anymore. I told him I would pay him well, that he and his Khanum would be comfortable. They looked to each other and did not say nothing. Later, after we had washed our hands and Farzana had served us grapes, Hassan said the village was his home now. He and Farzana had made a life for themselves there, and Bamiyan is so close. We know people there. Forgive me, Rahim Khan. I pray you understand. Of course, I said, you have nothing to apologize for. I understand. It was midway through the tea after Shorva that Hassan asked about you. I told him you were in America, but that I didn't know much more. Hassan had so many questions about you. Had you married? Did you have children? How tall are you? Did you still fly the kites and go to the cinema? Were you happy? He said he had befriended on an old Farsi teacher in Bamiyan who had taught him to read and write. If he wrote you a letter, would I pass it on to you? And did I think you would write back? I told him that I knew of you from the few phone conversations I had with your father, but mostly I didn't know how to answer them. Then he asked me about your father. When I told him, Hassan buried his face in his and broken into tears. He wept like a child for the rest of that night. They insisted that I spent the night there. Farzana fixed a coat for me and left me a glass of well water in case I got thirsty. All night I heard her whispering to Hassan and heard him sobbing. In the morning, Hassan told me he and Farzana had decided to move to Kabul with me. I should not have come there. I said, "You were right, Hassan Jan. You have a zindagi, a life there." It was presumptuous of me to just show up and ask you to drop everything. It is me who needs to be forgiven. We don't have that much to drop, Rahim Khan, Hassan said. His eyes were still red and puffy. We will go with you. We will help you to take care of the house. Are you absolutely sure? He nodded and dropped his head. Agha Sahib was like my second father. God give him peace. They piled their things in the center of the few worn rags and tied the corners together. We loaded the bundle into a Buick. Hassan stood in the threshold of the house and held the Quran as well as we all kissed it and passed under it. Then we left for Kabul. I remember as I was pulling away, Hassan turned to take a last look at their home. When we got to Kabul, I discovered that Hassan had no intention of moving into the house. But all these rooms are empty, Hassan Jan. No one is going to live in them, I said. But he would not. He said it was a matter of ihtiram, a matter of respect. He and Farzana moved their things into the hut in the backyard where he was born. I pleaded for them to move into one of the guest bedrooms upstairs, but Hassan would hear nothing of it. What will Amir Aga think? He said to me. What will he think when he comes back to Kabul after the war and finds that I have assumed his place in the house? Then in mourning for your father, Hassan wore black for the next 40 days. I did not want them to, but the two of them did all the cooking, all the cleaning. Hassan tended to the flowers in the garden, soaked the roots, picked off yellowing leaves, and planted rose bushes. He painted the walls in the house. He swept rooms no one had slept in for years and cleaned bathrooms no one had bathed in, like he was preparing the house for someone's return. Do you remember the wall behind the row of corn your father had planted, Amir Jan? What did you and Hassan call it? The wall of ailing corn? A rocket destroyed a whole section of that wall in the middle of the night. Early that fall, Hassan rebuilt it with his own hands, brick by brick, until it stood whole again. I do not know what I would have done if he had not been there. Then late the fall, Farzana gave birth to a stillborn baby girl. Hassan kissed the baby's lifeless face and we buried her in the backyard near the sweet briar bushes. We covered the little mound with leaves from the poplar trees. I said a prayer for her. Farzana stayed in the hut all the day and wailed. It is heartbreaking sound, Amir Jan, the wailing of a mother. I pray to Allah you never hear it. Outside the walls of that house there was a war raging. But the three of us in your father's house, we made our own little heaven from it. My vision started going by the late 1980s, so I had Hassan read me your mother's book. We would sit in the foyer by the stove and Hassan would read me from Masnavi or Khayyam as Farzana cooked in the kitchen, and every morning Hassan placed a flower on the little mound by the sweet briar bushes. In early 1990, Farzana became pregnant again. It was that same year in the middle of the summer that a woman covered in a sky blue burqa knocked on the front gates one morning. When I walked up to the gate, she was swaying on her feet like she was too weak to even stand. I asked her what she wanted, but she would not answer. Who are you? I said, but she just collapsed right there in the driveway. I yelled for Hassan and he helped me carry her into the house to the living room. We lay her on the sofa and took off her burqa. Beneath it, we found a toothless woman with stringy graying hair and sores on her arms. She looked like she had not eaten for days, but the worst of it by far was her face. Someone had taken a knife to it, and Amir Jan, the slashes cut this way and that way. One of the cuts went from cheekbone to her hairline, and it had no spared her left eye on the way. It was grotesque. I patted her brow with a wet cloth and she opened her eyes. Where is Hassan? She whispered. I am right here, Hassan said. He took her hand and squeezed it. Could I roll to him? I have walked long and far to see if you are as beautiful in the flesh as you are in my dreams, and you are even more. She pulled his hand to her face. Smile for me, please. Hassan did, and the old woman wept. You smiled coming out of me. Did anyone ever tell you? And I would not even hold you. Allah forgive me. I would not even hold you. None of us had seen Snowbird since she had eloped with a band of singers and dancers in 1964, just after she had given birth to Hassan. You never saw her, Amir, but in her youth she was a vision. She had a dimpled smile and a walk that drove men crazy. No one who passed her on the street, be it a man or a woman, could look at her only once. And now Hassan dropped her hand and bolted out of the house. I went after him, but he was too fast. I saw him running up the hill where you two used to play, his feet kicking up plumes of dust. I let him go. I sat with Snowbird all the day as the sky went from bright blue to purple. Hassan still had not come back when night fell and moonlight bathed the clouds. Snowbird cried that coming back had been a mistake, maybe even a worse one than leaving, but I made her stay. Hassan would return, I knew. He came back the next morning looking tired and weary, like he had not slept all the night. He took Snowbird's hand in both of his and told her she could cry if she wanted to, but she need not. She was home now, he said, home with her family. He touched the scars on her face and ran his hand through her hairs. Hassan and Farzana nursed her back to health. They fed her and washed her clothes. I gave her one of the guest rooms upstairs. Sometimes I would look out the window into the yard and watch Hassan and his mother kneeling together, picking tomatoes or trimming a rose bush, talking. They were catching up on all the lost years, I suppose. As far as I know, he never asked where she had been or why she had left, and she never told. I guess some stories do not need telling. It was Snowbird who delivered Hassan's son that winter of 1990. It had not started snowing yet, but the winter winds were blowing through the yards, bending the flower beds and rustling the leaves. I remember Snowbird came out of the hut holding her grandson, had him wrapped in a wool blanket. She stood beaming under a dull grey sky, tears streaming down her cheeks, the needle cold wind blowing her hair and clutching that baby in her arms like she never wanted to let go. Not this time. She handed him to Hassan and he handed him to me, and I sang the prayer of Ayatul Kursi in that little boy's ear. They named him Sohrab after Hassan's favorite hero from the Shahnama. As you know, Amirjan, he was a beautiful little boy, sweet as sugar and had the same temperament as his father. You should have seen Snowbird with that boy, Amirjan. He became the center of her existence. She sewed clothes for him, built him toys from scraps of wood, rags, and dried grass. When he caught a fever, she stayed up all the night and fasted for the 3 days. She burned isfand for him on a sicklet to cast out a nazar, the evil eye. By the time Sora was two, he was calling her Sasa. The two of them were inseparable. She lived to see him turn four, and then one morning she just did not wake up. She looked calm, at peace, like the she didn't mind dying now. We buried her in the cemetery on the hill, the one by the pomegranate tree, and I said a prayer for her too. The loss was hard on Hassan. It always hurts more to have and lose than to not have in the first place. But it was even harder on little Sorav. He kept walking around the house looking for Sasa, but you know how children are, they forget to so quickly. By then, that would have been 1995. The Shoravi were defeated and long gone, and Kabul belonged to Masood Rabbani and the Mujahideen. The infighting between the factions was fierce, and no one knew if they would live to see the end of the day. Our ears became accustomed to the whistle of falling shells, to the rumble of gunfire, our eyes familiar with the sight of men digging bodies out of piles of rubble. Kabul in those days, Amirjan, was as close as you could get that proverbial hell on earth. Allah was kind to us, though the Wazir Akbar Khan area was not attacked as much, so we did not have it as bad as some of the other neighborhoods. On those days when the rocket fire eased up a bit and the gunfighting was light, Hassan would take Sorab to the zoo to see Marjan the lion or the cinema. Hassan taught him how to shoot the slingshot, and later, by the time he was 8, Sorab had become deadly with that thing. He could stand on the terrace and hit a pine cone propped on a pail halfway across the yard. Hassan taught him to read and write. His son was not going to grow up illiterate like he had. I grew very attached to that little boy. I had seen him take his first step, heard him utter his first word. I bought children's book for Sarah from the bookstore by a cinema park. They have destroyed that too now. And Sarab read them as quickly as I could get them to him. He reminded me of you, how you loved to read when you were little. Amir Jan, sometimes I read to him at night, played riddles with him, taught him card tricks. I miss him terribly. In the winter time, Hassan took his son kite running. There were not nearly as many kite tournaments as in the old days. No one felt safe outside for long, but there were still a few scattered tournaments. Hassan would prop Sorab on his shoulders and they would go trouting through the streets, running kites, climbing trees where kites had dropped. You remember Amir Jan? What a good kite runner Hassan was. He was still just as good. At the end of the winter, Hassan and Sorab would hang the kites they had run all winter on the walls of the main hallway. They would put them like paintings. I told you how we celebrated in 1996 when the Taliban rolled in and put an end to the daily fighting. I remember coming home that night and finding Hassan in the kitchen listening to the radio. He had a sober look in his eyes. I asked him what was wrong and he just shook his head. God help the Hazaras now, Rahim Khan Sahib, he said. The war is over, Hassan, I said. There's going to be peace, inshallah, and happiness and calm. No more rockets, no more killing, no more funerals. But he just turned off the radio and asked if he could get me anything before he went to the bed. A few weeks later, the Taliban banned kite fighting, and 2 years later, in 1998, they massacred the Hazaras in Mazar-e Sharif.